welcome back to my channel. I'm Sonia Maya if you don't know me already. And if this is your first time here, please subscribe and like this if you liked this video. So today I was going to focus this video on what happens to the brain during an orgasm. But you know what? I'm gonna save that for later because I actually just had this really interesting conversation with my grandma yesterday about how dating was for her when she was in her teens, early adulthood. We had this really long conversation about dating in the 50s compared to dating now. And it was just a really interesting conversation. And I learned so much from her. So I figured that I would share some of the things that I learned and kind of compare the dating world from that era of 1950s, 60s to now based on what she said, and kind of compare her experience dating to my current experience dating. So it should be an interesting video. This is what's on my mind right now based on the conversation I just had with my grandmother. Don't you worry, I will post on orgasms next week. So stay tuned. In this video, I'm going to focus on 3 major differences between dating in the 1950s versus dating in 2020. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was the idea of waiting to get intimate. So I want to talk about my grandma's perspective on this because it's really interesting. My grandma pointed out to me that there were kind of 2 different types of women in the 1950s. There was women like her who would kind of go on dates here and there, feel people out, but she wouldn't get intimate with anybody at all. She was like a no touch. It was like a look, don't touch kind of thing.
You can't touch this.
So she said there was 2 different kinds of women. There was the ones that would go on dates but wouldn't let them even touch at all. Just look, don't touch. And then there were the women that she referred to as free. And these women, they would pretty much just have casual sex and just, it wasn't really referred to as a bad thing. There were just some women that would just have sex with whoever they wanted, casually date. And it's really interesting because I think it's a lot more common to do that now because sex is actually viewed as something that's more acceptable and not so taboo anymore. So it's a lot more common for women to be free in these days. But back then, although they did exist, there were a lot more women that definitely made people wait, even to hold hands. I also want to mention that I'm very blessed. I have a grandma and a mother that are very open-minded. So they're definitely cool with whatever I decide to do with my dating life. They'll never judge me for, sleeping with someone right away or waiting. They don't really, they as long as I'm protecting my heart and protecting my body, they're totally cool with what I do. So I wanted to point that out. But it's pretty interesting because when my grandma was 14, 15 years old, she was going on dates with men, but wasn't even letting them touch her at all. Like, no kissing, no arm on the shoulder during the movies, none of that, no hugging, just look, don't touch. And she explained that she had a very sexy body, a very sexy figure, and it wasn't that the men weren't attracted to her, but they just couldn't touch. And I mean, I think it made people go a little crazy about it because she was this very beautiful woman. I'm gonna put a picture up here of my grandma. Looked amazing. So she was just so beautiful. She was apparently the talk of the town. So she had guys asking her on dates left and right. Phone.
Call me on my cell phone.
Calling her up. And the dates that they would go on would be going to the movies or getting an ice cream, going on a walk. Something that she mentioned about the whole you can look but you can't touch aspect was she got a chance to get to know a lot of different men, and they had a lot of respect for her and kind of got to know her for her mind and her intelligence rather than focusing on the sex. I feel like taking the sex out of the picture, that actually leads to more intelligent conversation sometimes, or just getting deep into, intellectual things that might be on each other's mind because sex is taken out of the picture. So they might actually learn more about you and be more interested in getting to know you because of that fact. So it's pretty interesting. She started dating when she was 15, and she actually met my grandfather around that time, and she said that she wasn't sexually attracted to him right away, but he's the only man that she's ever been sexually attracted to. My granddad has also never been with anybody but my grandma, so they've literally only been with each other. which is like super rare these days, but I think it's really cool. So if I'm remembering correctly, my grandmother and my grandfather, they dated for like 4 to 6 weeks with no touching or anything like that. And then they started getting intimate when my grandfather proposed to my grandmother, and it was only like 4 to 6 weeks or something like that. And then once they got engaged, that's when they started getting intimate. So after learning all of this about how dating was in the 50s in terms of women that would wait to get intimate versus women that wouldn't, the free women, I asked my grandma, like, so what do you think about nowadays? Do you think that it makes sense to wait before getting intimate? And she said that she thinks it's a good idea, especially because it gives you that opportunity for somebody to see you as you are as a person and to respect your intellect and just like explore you as a person without the sex kind of confusing things. And I just want to say that I definitely agree with this perspective. I'm still a little conflicted because I know that it's possible, like I've said in my other video, I know it's possible to have sex on the first date and still have a successful relationship. But I'm also kind of leaning more towards this idea that if you are really feeling somebody and you just started dating, maybe it's best to wait. And I need to also stop saying make him wait or make her wait, if it's like a, not a heterosexual situation. We should stop saying making the other person wait, because we're really actually both making us wait. So both partners are waiting. It's not just one or the other. It's really hard to explain that for some reason. But yes, I do think that there is value in waiting. So I might actually start picking that up myself. Let's take time to really feel each other out and then let the intimacy come as it comes. But I'm not talking trash on the having sex right away thing. Ultimately just depends on the situation. But overall, like I said in my other video, I think there's a lot of value in going with the flow. So just do whatever feels right. I believe that if it's the right person, it's the right person for you, no matter when you have sex. But in a lot of cases, waiting is definitely a good idea. So comment your thoughts below, because I'm still in a debate in my head about this topic. Second thing I wanted to talk about while comparing and contrasting the 50s of dating versus now is the gender roles. So when thinking about history, it's so true that, people were so sexist for so long. There was this, society was pretty much like the man goes to work and he's the breadwinner, he's the one that makes the money, while the wife stays at home and cooks and cleans. Like, thank goodness, time went by, women started becoming more independent, and there's been more women that are working. So the thing with gender roles is a lot of men still feel like, to this day, a lot of men still feel like, I want the woman to cook and clean. I'm glad that it's not as much as before, but that was pretty much the norm, because the men would go to the work and the women would be at home. So my grandmother explained to me that this was pretty much the case like back in the day. If a man was married to a woman, he was expected to go to work and the woman was expected to be in the kitchen and cleaning. So it was actually embarrassing or unheard of for a man to be helping out around the house. So my grandmother told me this story that sometimes my granddad he was such a great husband, he was such a keeper. So he would help around the house sometimes, but he wouldn't want his friends to know about it. So let's say he was cleaning up the floor and some friends would come up to the door, knocking on the door. He would be like, oh no, like no one can see me do this. Like no one can see me clean because like they'll make fun of me, because it was so unheard of and so uncommon for a man to help around the house. So I thought that was an interesting thing to think about. Like, it's so different now with gender roles. It's a lot more acceptable for a guy to be cooking and cleaning and helping out, and I think that that's a good thing, definitely. And there's still, of course, sexism and a lot of issues with gender roles, and women still have to fight for their rights and all of that with like the Me Too movement. But I'm glad that it's different than it was, because I just think it's ridiculous, because there should be equality. So the last thing I wanted to talk about in terms of differences between dating in the 50s versus now, the way that people were asked out on dates. So like when my grandma would go on these dates with these men, they would call her on the phone, and that's the way it is. They probably using those phones that like you gotta, those old-fashioned phones where you gotta like spin it around. So they're using those phones to call up grandma and be like, hey, what's up? Let's go get some ice cream. And she's all like, you can look, but you can't touch.
You can't touch this.
So that's how it worked back in the day. They would call on the phone. They'd all talk about this like talk of the town girl, and then they call her up on the phone. And obviously with no ability for dating apps. So versus 2020, where you can just go on Tinder or Hinge or Bumble or any of those dating apps, and then a lot of people meet each other that way. People still call each other up on the phone, but generally it's like a meeting in person. That doesn't really happen as much anymore. It still happens, but the story of how my grandmother and my granddad met, they were actually next door neighbors, and they knew of each other, but they never actually like interacted. Apparently my grandma, since she was like dating like 5 men at once, even though they couldn't touch her, she went on a date with some guy, but she didn't really like him that much, some like lawyer guy. She didn't really think he was that nice. But he was telling my granddad, like, oh yeah, she's just so, yeah, I don't know what's wrong with her. I think he just like felt butthurt and rejected because my grandma wasn't feeling that. But my granddad was like, well, if she's so popular, then what do you mean? What do you mean she isn't all that? No, there must be something there. So my granddad decides to call my grandma on the phone, and then they go on a date. And luckily, they ended up being sexually attracted to each other, and thank goodness that worked out, because I wouldn't be here, would I? So we have the people calling on the phone in the 50s, the 60s, calling up, let's go get ice cream, let's go on a date. And then versus now, where you can obviously meet on social media or on dating apps, and it's just so different. It's crazy how different it is. And unfortunately, the whole social media thing, the texting, the way that we exchange communication these days, makes it really easy for people to ghost. And if you haven't already seen it, check out my video on ghosting. Ghosting is rude. And it's funny because ghosting has actually been around forever, but it's actually like a new term that was coined recently. And I'm just thinking about it, and it's like, I feel like in the 50s you definitely could ghost someone, but it's a lot more difficult. And at least in the 50s you can't see the person that ghosted you posting on their story or looking at your story. I guess ghosting in the 50s would be like, all right, yeah, I'll call you for another date, and then they just never call. But at the same time, it's not the same. And ghosting has definitely changed its definition, and it's become so easy to do because of how easy it is to communicate via texting, FaceTime, and calls. If you enjoyed this video on thinking about dating in the 50s versus now, it's really interesting to think about how times have changed. And it's also pretty cool to think about how the way that she dated, my grandmother dated, was so different than the way I date now. And I really admire, grandparents that have been together for such a long time. And I feel like that's really uncommon, and it's really sad. And there's a lot more divorces and breakups, and there's a lot more of that these days. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that casual sex is a lot more common. I mean, I think it's really good that sex isn't being seen as this deviant thing, and people should go with the flow and do what they want. Maybe the reason that more people stayed together before was because there were more women that were kind of like saving it to marriage or saving it for a true connection. And then these days we have so many people that are doing one-night stands and having meaningless sex, and it might make it harder to really find a connection with someone. But I'm kind of just rambling. These are just like things that are popping into my head. I would love to hear your thoughts below. Thank you so much for watching this video. I'm going to be posting relationship and psychological advice on Wednesdays and fitness inspiration on Saturdays. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.